Hello and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. I'm joining you from my home library in Eastern Washington today. Although after this class, I'm going to be driving to Seattle, from where I will be teaching for the next 2 weeks. And today I wanted to provide you with a brief introduction to a really interesting and quite controversial slash difficult argument that Slavoj Žižek makes in his collected book Cogito and the Unconscious, which is an edited collection of various Žižek adjacent thinkers and philosophers, such as Alenka Zupančič and Mladen Dolar, as to the question of the relationship between philosophy and psychoanalysis, with a specific emphasis on the notion of the Cartesian cogito and its relationship to the Freudian Lacanian unconscious. And so what I'd like to talk about today is Slavoj Žižek's argument about what he calls the madness of modern philosophy, or perhaps more precisely, the constitutive madness of modern philosophy. And if you understand this idea, it can be really helpful when it comes to understanding Žižek's broader project. In fact, perhaps his most direct articulation of what you might call this problematic, his rereading of the Cartesian cogito and his advocation of a return to the Cartesian cogito, is outlined in his book, The Ticklish Subject, namely the ticklish subject being the subject of the Cartesian cogito. So what I'd like to do in this short session is give you both a basic introduction to the introduction as to this book, which we will continue to read throughout the rest of this week, as well as to sort of give you a basic introduction to Žižek's take on the Cartesian cogito and why he argues for a return to it. On that note, I should say thank you to everybody joining us today. It's such a key part of this project, I think, the live stream. For me, certainly, it's very important that once a week we gather together and that we share in this philosophical exchange. So thank you very much for your time and your attention and for being part of this community. I'd also like to express my thanks and my gratitude to the patrons who allow me to make these very niche philosophical videos. My goal and my dream has always been to make philosophy and theory accessible without losing its complexity, without simply reducing it to mere content. And so thank you to the patrons who allow me to financially keep up that project. If you'd like to download my complete guide to Žižek ebook series, as well as my Intro to Hegel series, plus the audio downloads for the lectures and the edited transcripts courtesy of Jeneline, plus a weekly seminar that I post every week, please do consider visiting Patreon, where you can sign up to the different corresponding tiers. On that note, let us begin, and please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining in from today. It never ceases to amaze me how genuinely international we are as a philosophical classroom. Okay, let's begin. The madness of modern philosophy. Or perhaps to be precise, the constitutive madness of modern philosophy is how Žižek describes the Cartesian turn. Now, first of all, when it comes to the Cartesian cogito, I think, therefore I am, usually there are two ways in which it is conceived. Either as the triumph of humanist reason, namely all scientific and logical, empirical advancements stem from the Cartesian cogito, the cogito who works towards the ultimate goal of achieving self-knowledge, the so-called self-transparent subject. This is one way to look at the Cartesian cogito, what you might call the classical humanist way. And then we have, excuse me, a second way of looking at it, which is the deconstructionist, postmodern, critical lens, which essentially reduces the Cartesian cogito to a kind of ideology, a cultural myth of sorts, by which the declaration of the individual as ascendant becomes tied to a variety of cultural and ideological projects that are supposed to create a more hedonistic, self-involved, individualistic pursuit of the self. This is then contrasted with what you might call the postmodern turn against the Cartesian cogito, which is that instead of asserting the ideal of a self-transparent knowledge, a subject who properly knows reality, instead it becomes about the articulation of multiplicities, specifically multiplicities of identity. Here we have what are essentially the two, or if you will, three dominant attitudes towards the Cartesian cogito today. On the one hand, the traditional classical humanist one that emphasizes the Cartesian cogito as the radical emergence of reasonable skeptical subjectivity. Then we have the deconstructionist turn, which renders it a kind of Enlightenment myth, to which one would also count Adorno and Horkheimer's famous tract on Enlightenment as myth. And then the contemporary postmodern take, in which we leave behind the idealistic goal of the self-transparent subject so as to fully engage in the multiplicity of different identities. Against this, Žižek articulates something completely different. Žižek's basic position is that with the emergence of the idea of the Cartesian cogito, I think, therefore I am, we don't actually have the emergence of a rational subject who is supposed to bring philosophy down to earth and initiate the Enlightenment turn towards skepticism, rationalism, etc. Instead, we have what might appear as the exact opposite. The Cartesian cogito as the emergence of a kind of imminent madness to the philosophical system as such. In a sense, Žižek is being very Lacanian here. Lacan already points out that the Cartesian cogito isn't simply about a rationalist formula, I think, therefore I am, or to be precise, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. Instead, for Lacan, the Cartesian cogito is inherently already neurotic, which is to say, if the formula is I think, therefore I am, then vice versa, once you stop thinking, you, strictly speaking, no longer exist. Therefore, the Cartesian cogito is the emergence of a kind of neurotic subject, a subject who has to posit his own existence against the ground of his own thought so as not to fall into the imminent abyss of his own non-identity. This means that Žižek's basic wager is that the Cartesian cogito does not present itself as the triumph of humanism, but instead as the emergence of an inherently anti-humanist gesture or stance within the tradition of philosophy. Or, in very Žižekian ways, he says that the Cartesian cogito is the emergence of a properly excremental subject within the order of the traditional philosophical horizon. In fact, he says that, therefore, the emergence of the Cartesian subject is not so much the humanist triumph, inasmuch as it is an anti-humanist gesture. Think about it. In the traditional order of being, what you might call classical antiquity, we have basically the assumption that there is a universal order represented by the gods, for example. And it is the prerogative of the particular, of the subject, to align himself with said order, to live in natural accordance with both the laws of nature and the laws of gods. And the whole point of, for example, tragedy in antiquity is to point out what happens to the subject who goes against the will of the gods. In other words, the concept of hubris is the divine punishment, if you will, for the particular who refuses to subordinate himself as to this divine, universal, if you will, cosmic order. Of course, the underlying point of great tragedies, for example, Antigone, is precisely that the subject is caught within what appear to be irreducible contradictions. Is one loyal to the family or loyal to the state? Is one loyal to the gods? Is one loyal to one's brother, etc.? So it's not as simple as saying that hubris is simply a moral normative framework by which the subject is supposed to be aligned with the dictum dicti of the gods. Instead, it's much more about the overall aim of philosophy being bringing the subject into the particular horizon as to the universal order, for which hubris is the designation as to the subject's irreconcilable difficulty in so doing. However, with the Cartesian cogito, we have what appears to be a radical undermining of this basic proposition. Instead of the universal order of law, the godly realm, and the particular subject who has to find himself in accordance with this universal, instead we have the subject as the horizon against which the universal is posited in the first place. In fact, Žižek says that Kant was one of the first thinkers to properly understand and assume the logical consequences as to this Cartesian turn. In fact, Žižek puts it quite beautifully. I wrote it down here. He says, the Kantian problematic is as follows. what appears as an epistemological limitation of our capacity to grasp reality, i.e. the fact that we are forever perceiving reality from our finite temporal standpoint, is the positive condition of reality itself. Now, this is a fairly dense statement, but essentially Žižek's basic argument is that Kant already understood one of the imminent problems within the Cartesian cogito, which is that Kant understood that the subject was therefore no longer simply subject to the universal order. Instead, the universal order had to be retroactively posited by the subject. In other words, in Žižek's expression, what we call reality is therefore the irreducible relationship between reality as it is observed by the subject, the world of phenomena, and reality as it is posited by the subject, the noumenal or spectral speculative realm, as Hegel would later call it. Therefore, to put it very simply, the transition that the Cartesian cogito accomplishes is that the subject is no longer that which is to be reconciled with the universal. In other words, it's not about the difference between the universal and the particular. Instead, it is now about the difference, the irreconcilable difference, if you will, that is constitutive to the subject and to the universal as such. Which is to say, it's not about the difference between the universal and the particular, it is the immanent difference, which is that of the subject itself. Or to put it slightly differently, after Descartes, it is the subject himself who represents this disorder, the gap in the order of being. And so the goal of philosophy is no longer to integrate the subject into the order of being. The subject is the constitutive madness, the constitutive gap against which the universal exception of this order emerges. Now, this is all nevertheless quite abstract. So I suggest that we take a step back here to briefly think about how this relates to psychoanalysis and why the subject of the unconscious, which Lacan refers and affiliates directly with the cogito, Lacan's formula being that the cogito is the subject of the unconscious, how this relates back to the philosophical argument that Slavoj Žižek is making. So let's begin with something very simple. Žižek says that when it comes to the relationship between philosophy and psychoanalysis, there are essentially two dominant approaches. The first is essentially a philosophical attempt to supplement psychoanalysis. In other words, we have philosophers who are curious about psychoanalysis and they're interested in it. And so they try to essentially create a bridge between the two, creating the philosophical foundations upon which the psychoanalysis might be based. This is the more respectable version of the two. The second one, which Žižek entirely rejects, is the process by which we pathologize philosophers retroactively. This could be as simple as saying something like Schopenhauer was a terrible man because he liked solitude and he pushed a woman down the stairs, therein breaking her arm. Or it could be a more advanced pathologization about the manner in which the Kantian problem of the antinomies represents some kind of repressed urge for the child to affirm himself against the master or God, etc. It's all kinds of horrible speculative theories. And Žižek says that against these two propositions, the philosophization of psychoanalysis and the pathologization of philosophy, we should introduce what is essentially the Lacanian approach. The Lacanian approach for Slavoj Žižek is to essentially reveal a dimension, a key dimension within philosophy that remains, if you will, secret or hidden even to philosophy itself. Now, it's important to note here that one might almost describe this as Žižek's overall method, which is to say that what Žižek really likes to do is to suggest that the history of Western philosophy is a sequence by which each subsequent generation is able to shed light on a key truth that was imminently hidden within that of the previous generation. For example, when it comes to the relationship between Kant and Hegel, as we said, Kant was already able to articulate an irreducible problem within the Cartesian cogito. Hegel then radicalizes what is in Kant more than Kant himself, as it were, which is precisely how it appears to be the barrier towards absolute reason is in fact the very door. The dialectical tension between subject and substance therefore emerges no longer as an irreducible barrier, but precisely as a solution in its own right. This is also why Slavoj Žižek likes to argue that Kant is the vanishing mediator for Hegel, Hegel is the vanishing mediator for Marx, and so on and so forth. The basic argument for Žižek is that every philosophy contains within it a kind of secret, a kernel of truth that cannot by definition be understood against the horizons of the moment in which it was thought, and that can only be properly understood by a subsequent theorist who appears to negate it, nevertheless thereby universalizing it, accomplishing it. Žižek likes to say that therefore a theory discovers what is more in X than in X. Of course, for Žižek, his main wager is that Lacanian psychoanalysis finds in philosophy what is in philosophy more than in philosophy, that it essentially appears to contradict it. It appears to be an antithesis to it, a radical anti-philosophy, and yet nevertheless in so doing precisely completes it or takes it to its next logical evolution. In fact, Žižek's basic position, which he articulates perhaps most clearly in his book, The Tickler Subject, is that Lacan should never be read as a postmodern structuralist thinker, which is to say that Lacan isn't simply trying to move into what you might call the speculative turn as to the multiplicity of identities. In fact, Lacan should be read, according to Žižek, as someone who stages a return to the Cartesian cogito. In other words, the Lacanian infamous or famous return to Freud should be articulated in its properly philosophical dimension, which is to say a return to the Cartesian cogito, except with a twist. A return to the Cartesian cogito not as the height of subjective reason, but instead in the sense that it is the introduction of a kind of constitutive madness, a madness which Žižek labels the constitutive madness of modern philosophy. Therefore, by means of reading Lacan against philosophy, we can see how the Cartesian cogito introduces a radical break, not between the subject and substance, the universal order of being, but instead makes it immanent to the subject itself. Žižek says that the subject of the unconscious is therefore how a reading of the Freudian unconscious can reveal to us a different interpretation as to the lineage or the development of Western philosophy as such. Žižek says that this means that the unconscious and the Freudian discovery of the unconscious, namely not an entity which has any formal content as such, but instead an entity which has to be read through the content as to the form of its repressed emanations, is a shibboleth of sorts. But I realize that once again, I'm introducing a lot of jargon and abstractions here. So once again, let us take a step back. Žižek has an interesting observation. He says that the manner in which we view the Cartesian cogito is itself a kind of shibboleth, which is to say that it appears to us differently depending on whether or not we take into account the Freudian theory of the unconscious. And it's important to note here that his theory of the shibboleth here isn't simply that as to the different enunciative practices, two different people who say shibboleth in a different way, thereby revealing what their affiliation or identity is. Instead, he takes from I believe it's Robert Flanner, he puts this in the footnotes, he takes a theory of the shibboleth, which essentially argues that the identity of something is always overdetermined by a certain exceptional category through which it is framed. Now, this is very abstract, so let me give you an example. Let's say that think about in theological terms when it comes to miracles. The materialist, rationalist stance on miracles would be to say miracles don't exist. After all, we can't turn water into wine, etc. There's no way in which there is a miracle. However, the theological counterpoint to this would be to say that miracle exists everywhere all the time. One just has to notice them, or perhaps more crucially, one has to see them as miracles in the first place. For example, on a very pseudo-spiritual level, you could say that life itself is a kind of miracle, that the fact that the sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening is a kind of miracle, etc. This isn't simply a reductionist take on the idea of miracle. It reveals a structural process, which is to say that if one views reality through a theological lens, then what appears as ordinary contingent reality is miraculous. If one views it through a strictly speaking rationalist lens, then reality appears as irreducibly real, as non-miraculous. Therefore, the miracle for the rationalist atheist has to be something which stands against reality. Whereas from a theological perspective, miracle is imminent to reality as such. Žižek says that the stance from which one views something, therefore retroactively changes the very nature of the reality through which it is viewed or seen. And he says that the same thing is true when it comes to the Freudian unconscious and to the cogito. Here we can see how the very title of the book, Cogito and the Unconscious, is itself a shibboleth, which is to say, the manner in which one views the meaning of the sentence reveals retroactively where one stands apropos philosophy and psychoanalysis. Usually, from, let's say, a non-Žižekian, non-Lacanian perspective, the sentence cogito and the unconscious would appear to suggest an irreducible divide. Namely, the unconscious would be the discovery of something that stands irreducibly against the cogito. The cogito, which has as its goal the emergence or the accumulation, the triumph of a self-reflective knowledge, a self-transparent subject, appears to be irreducibly contradicted by the idea of the unconscious, namely a subject which has no fundamental core content which could in that way be known. Therefore, from a strictly speaking, let's say, normie philosophical approach, the cogito and the unconscious would appear to be almost binary opposites. The cogito being the promise of a subject that can achieve self-transparent knowledge as to the ultimate horizons of meaning and reality, substance, versus the subject of the unconscious who is forever barred, who forever stands against the horizon of achieving such knowledge. However, from a Žižekian, Lacanian point of view, as I said before, the Lacanian formula is that the cogito is the subject of the unconscious. Therefore, the sentence or the title, Cogito and the Unconscious, is no longer read as an irreducible contradiction, but instead as being one and the same thing. In the same way that if you said apples and oranges, usually we think that it's apples versus oranges. They're not the same thing. Whereas the title suggests that they are the same thing, apples and oranges as irreducibly the same. This means that Žižek's basic proposition is that how one stands apropos, or where one stands apropos the Freudian unconscious and the Lacanian return to Freud, renders different the manner in which one reads the title of this book. Therefore, to be a Žižekian Lacanian is to read this title of the book and see similarity, cogito and the unconscious being the highest expression of the madness, which is constitutive within the idea of the cogito as such, versus the, again, normie, if you will, philosophical approach that would see them as irreducibly separated. Now, I think it's a little bit difficult sometimes to emphasize just how radical and revolutionary this argument actually is, which is to say that when I was a student, to suggest that there was a relationship between the cogito and the unconscious in a co-constitutive way was perceived as a kind of heresy, as it were. In other words, when I was a student, the predominant wisdom, which I think remains true for many people today, certainly within leftist and progressive circles, is that the cogito is something to be inherently distrustful of, that the entire emergence of what you might call continental thought is the process of demystifying and deconstructing the idea of the Cartesian cogito. In fact, devaluating and exposing, if you will, for what it is, the project as to the self-transparent subject as an inherently ideologically motivated one. Against this, Žižek takes what appears to be a radically reductionist turn. We're going back to the cogito, except, and this is key, hence why I'm repeating it, Žižek's return to the cogito is actually about shedding light on a completely different cogito. Or, to simplify somewhat, you could say that Žižek tries to unearth what is repressed within the emergence of the Cartesian cogito as such. Once again, this is the repression of the cogito not as the height of individual reason, but instead the emergence of a neurotic/hysterical subject. If I stop thinking, I no longer exist. And secondly, the emergence of what appears to be an anti-humanist philosophy. Man is out of joint with the universal nature under the guise of its exact opposite, man as the subjective figure of reason. In fact, Žižek makes a quite radical argument here, which I think is nevertheless quite entertaining. He says, strictly speaking, when seen through this lens, we could argue that Erasmus, no, not Erasmus, I need to double check. Was it Luther? Apologies. It must be Luther, I think. That Luther, I'm going to say it's Luther because it makes more sense. That strictly speaking, Luther is the first anti-humanist. Now, why would Luther be the first anti-humanist? We usually think of it as the exact other way around, Luther being one of the first humanists. In fact, you can see this is characteristically Žižekian here. He likes to take something that appears to be commonly accepted and then turn it completely on its head. For Žižek, Luther's idea that human beings are essentially excremental, that they are the thing which comes out of the anus of God, very Žižekian here, of course, is the emergence of subjectivity as a kind of stain upon reality, subjectivity as a kind of irreducible problem that is forever out of joint, and that in this out of jointness is nevertheless constitutive to the universal order of being as such. It is the horizon against which it is posited, once again, the Kantian problematic. Žižek's argument, therefore, is that this actually presents a radical break with what appeared to be the role of human subjectivity in a pre-Cartesian sense. Which is to say, in a pre-Cartesian philosophical conception of the subject was supposed to be the emergence of the highest in the lowest, which is to say, fallen man who's to be reunited with the heavenly order, whether this is the Christian order of the fall from paradise, or it is the divine order of being in a classical sense of antiquity. However, in the emergence of the Cartesian cogito, we no longer have a subject who stands at the highest, namely the subject as being the figure who is to stage the reconciliation between lowly fallen man and the higher order of divinity. Instead, we have a subject who, for Žižek, in very Žižekian terms, on a fundamental, irreducible level, remains a piece of shit. This subject as piece of shit, subject as excremental, is really important for Žižek, as the manner in which subjectivity emerges in its properly philosophical dimension only to the extent in which it has to be posited as anti-humanist. Žižek's basic argument, therefore, is not to demystify or expose the Cartesian cogito as the ideology of enlightenment, as it were, but instead to do almost the exact opposite, to show how the truth of the Cartesian cogito, which is repressed precisely in the ideology of enlightenment, is that it in fact irreducibly excrementalizes, turns into shit, the idea of the subject. And this traumatic content of the shitty subject of the Cartesian cogito, the neurotic, hysterical subject of madness, therefore has to be repressed by means of being elevated to the subject of self-transparent knowledge, the subject who is supposed to bring about the inherent progress of the Enlightenment. That's essentially Žižek's position here, or what he calls the madness of modern philosophy. And so, to conclude, it's important to note that for Žižek, the madness of modern philosophy is not a pejorative against postmodern philosophy. Instead, what he means by modern philosophy is the philosophy that emerges after the Cartesian turn. I think, therefore I am. And this madness for Žižek is not a bad thing. It's not a pejorative normative category. Instead, it is a constitutive madness. The constitutive madness by which the subject becomes the irreducible materialization as to the gap immanent between the order of substance and the order of things. Noumenon, phenomenon. This means that it changes the nature of subjectivity in its relationship to the traditional ontological question. The traditional classical ontological question was always, how can the human be reconciled with the order of things? How can the phenomena be used to deduce or deduct, if you will, the idea of substance, the noumenon? Instead, with the Cartesian turn for Žižek, what happens is that the ontological question changes. The ontological question is now, why is the subject a piece of shit? And why is this piece of shit, this excremental subjectivity, nevertheless necessary for the unfolding of Western philosophy into its apparent opposite? This madness of modern philosophy is therefore not so much the problem of modern philosophy. It is, in fact, in a sense, its central truth, its repressed knowledge or key. And Žižek's wager, to conclude, is that it is only through the psychoanalytic lens, it is only through Lacanian Freudian psychoanalysis that we can unearth or reveal the central truth of Western metaphysical ontological development, which is to say, cogito and the unconscious is the process by which we reveal the constitutive madness within the Cartesian subject, thereby staging a return, and if you will, a rescue process as to the Cartesian cogito as such. That is Žižek's wager in The Madness of Modern Philosophy, which you can also read about in his edited volume called Cogito and the Unconscious. And for the next week or so, I'll try to give you some introductions to the wonderful collection of texts in this book, both Mladen Dolar and Alenka Zupancic, and various others. So we're sort of broadening our horizon when it comes to the analysis of Žižek's thought and the figures that exist within his purview as his if you will, as his comrades, as his co-thinkers. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that has been helpful and useful to you. And if you'd like to support me in making these daily videos, please do consider becoming a patron, for it makes a world of difference and really allows me to keep doing this, which brings me great joy and hopefully also stands as, I don't know, as something of importance to yourself. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week. And indeed, I see you in the Discord Q&A. Yes, I will be hosting a Q&A in the Discord, which is accessible to patrons. So I'm going to do that, and I hope that my head cold hasn't affected the sound quality too much today. We'll see. See you tomorrow.